When a black boy goes to school, he falls in love with a white girl, but she racially abuses him and bullies him. Years later, he discovers she was in love with him all along. The room pulsed with heat, a haze of sweat and whispered moans filling the air. Candlelight flickered across bare skin, casting shadows that danced like secrets on the walls of the small Westwood bungalow. Marcus's hands, strong and deliberate, traced the curve of Susan's spine, her pale skin trembling beneath his touch as she arched into him, her breath hitching in a rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Beside them, Angela's fingers tangled in John's blonde hair, pulling him closer as their lips met in a kiss that was all fire and desperation, her dark skin glistening against his in the dim glow. The bed creaked under the weight of their tangled bodies, four souls colliding in a storm of passion that had been brewing for months, hidden beneath the surface of polite smiles and neighborly nods. Susan's voice broke through the haze, a soft, needy whimper as she murmured Marcus's name, her hands clutching his shoulders like he was her salvation. John's eyes, locked on Angela, burned with a hunger that went beyond lust, a longing that had festered in silence. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken truth that this moment would unravel everything they'd built. No words were needed, their bodies spoke a language of their own, raw and unfiltered as the night swallowed them whole. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the world outside their walls fading into irrelevance. The neighborhood, with its sneers and hurled tomatoes, its slashed tires and broken glass, ceased to exist. Here in this forbidden dance, there was only the heat of skin on skin, the taste of salt and desire, the sound of breaths mingling in the dark. But even as they surrendered to the ecstasy, a shadow lingered, an awareness that this was no beginning, but an end masquerading as a climax. The story didn't start here, though. It began a year earlier, in the spring of 1984, when Marcus and Angela Jackson rolled into the Westwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, with a beat-up Chevy Impala and a dream stitched together with hope and grit. The sun hung low over the palm-lined streets, casting golden streaks across the modest bungalow they'd scraped every penny to buy. Marcus, tall and broad-shouldered, unloaded boxes with a quiet determination, his dark eyes scanning the row of neat lawns and pastel houses. Angela, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, carried a potted plant inside, her smile wide despite the exhaustion etched into her features. They were 32, married 5 years, and ready to plant roots in a city that promised opportunity if you could survive its underbelly. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, their stares sharp as knives. The Jacksons were the first black family on Elmwood Drive, and the air crackled with unspoken resentment. Marcus felt it first, a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze, as he waved at a man watering his lawn across the street. The man turned away, his hose spraying the grass with deliberate indifference. Angela noticed it too, her smile faltering, as a woman in a floral dress hurried her kids inside, whispering something that made the children glance back with wide, wary eyes. Still, they pressed on, unpacking their lives into a space they hoped would become home. The abuse started small, like a drip that turns into a flood. A week after they moved in, Marcus stepped outside to find "Go Back" scrawled in chalk on their driveway. He scrubbed it with a bucket of soapy water, his jaw tight, while Angela watched from the porch, her arms crossed. "It's just kids," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. But it wasn't just kids. By summer, tomatoes splattered against their front door, red juice dripping down the wood like blood. Tires hissed flat in the night, slashed by unseen hands. Car windows shattered under rocks hurled from the shadows, glass glittering on the pavement like cruel stars. The neighborhood didn't just dislike them, they despised them, and every act was a message. "You don't belong." Marcus bore his burdens with a quiet fury, his fists clenching rhythmically at his sides as he patched tires, swept shards of glass from the garage floor, and wrestled with rusted bolts. He worked as a mechanic at Hensley's Auto Repair, a gritty shop nestled in the heart of downtown, where the roar of engines and the hiss of air compressors drowned out the slurs he'd grown accustomed to hearing. The city pulsed around him, cars honking, radios blaring, the faint hum of life beyond the grease-stained walls. But inside the garage, time seemed to slow, each day a test of endurance. His hands, calloused and stained with oil, moved with precision, but his mind churned with the weight of unspoken words. He'd been born in South Central, raised on cracked asphalt and resilience, and though he'd clawed his way out to Elmwood Drive, the past clung to him like engine grime. His boss, Margaret Hensley, was a white woman in her mid-40s, sharp-tongued and sharper-eyed, with a presence that dominated the shop like a storm cloud. Her hair, a faded blonde streaked with gray, was perpetually pulled back in a tight bun, and her green eyes glinted with a mix of authority and something less definable. She'd inherited the garage from her late husband, a gruff man who'd built it from nothing. And she ran it now with an iron grip, her voice cutting through the din like a blade. She'd hired Marcus reluctantly, 6 months ago, muttering under her breath about giving him a chance, as she handed him a wrench and pointed him to a busted Chevy. But her words often carried a venom that stung deeper than the rocks flung at his home by faceless cowards in the night. "You're slow today, Jackson," she'd snap, her gaze lingering too long on his broad shoulders and muscular frame as he bent over an engine, sweat beading on his dark skin. "Maybe you people aren't cut out for this kind of work." The phrase hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, and Marcus would grit his teeth, his jaw tight, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response. Yet there was something else in her tone, a heat that contradicted her barbs, a flicker in her eyes that Marcus pretended not to notice. She'd brush past him in the narrow space between workbenches, her arm grazing his, her perfume a cloying mix of jasmine and cigarettes, lingering long after she'd moved on. Once, when he'd stayed late to finish a transmission job, she'd emerged from her cluttered office with 2 beers in hand, her blouse unbuttoned just enough to reveal the curve of her collarbone. "You've earned this," she'd said, her voice softer than usual, her fingers brushing his as she handed him the bottle. He'd declined with a curt no thanks, his tone firm but polite, and turned back to his work. But her stare had followed him, heavy and unyielding, tracking him through the dimly lit shop, until he'd grabbed his jacket and left. That night he'd walked the 6 miles home, the cold December air biting at his skin, her gaze still burning into his back. At home, Angela kept their fragile world spinning. She was a seamstress by trade, her nimble fingers coaxing life from threadbare fabric, stitching dresses and curtains for neighbors who paid in cash and guarded smiles. By day, she filled the small bungalow with the scents of simmering stew and cornbread, the clatter of pots a quiet rebellion against the chaos outside. By night, she sat with Marcus on their sagging couch, her voice a whisper of reassurance. "We'll make it through, baby. We always do." She'd grown up in South Central too, a few blocks from Marcus, where survival meant thick skin and a quick wit. Her armor was forged in the crucible of that life, dodging cat calls, outsmarting hustlers, holding her head high when the world tried to grind her down. But here on Elmwood Drive, that armor was wearing thin. The constant assaults, the rocks, the muttered slurs, the cold stares chipped away at her spirit. Her laughter, once a bright melody that filled their home, grew rarer as the months dragged on, replaced by a quiet resolve that masked her exhaustion. The neighbors, John and Susan Carter, had seemed like a flicker of hope when the Jacksons first arrived. They lived next door in a tidy ranch-style house with a manicured lawn and a row of rose bushes. Susan tended with care. John, a lanky man in his late 30s with sun-bleached blonde hair and an easy grin, had waved cheerfully over the fence the day Marcus and Angela moved in, his voice carrying a Midwestern warmth. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Susan, petite and soft-spoken, with blue eyes that sparkled like cut glass, had followed an hour later with a still warm apple pie, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it over. "We're glad you're here," she'd said. And for a moment, Angela had believed her. They'd chat sometimes. Small talk about the weather, the roses, the way the streetlights flickered after dusk. John worked as a sales rep for a hardware chain, always in a crisp shirt and tie, while Susan taught piano lessons from their living room, the faint strains of Chopin drifting across the yard. They were different, Angela thought, a lifeline in a sea of hostility. But even they couldn't stem the tide of hate washing over Elmwood Drive. By winter, the abuse had escalated beyond whispered threats and petty vandalism. It started subtly, a slashed tire on Marcus's truck, a crude word scrawled in chalk on their driveway, but it grew bolder with each passing week. One frigid November night, a brick crashed through their living room window, shattering the glass into 1,000 jagged pieces. Angela had been sitting on the couch, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. When it happened, the brick landed inches from her feet, the tea spilling across her lap as she leapt up with a cry. Marcus stormed outside, his voice a roar into the darkness. "Who's out there? Show your—" But the culprits had vanished, leaving only the echo of mocking laughter and the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He stood there, chest heaving, his breath fogging in the cold, until Angela pulled him back inside, her hands trembling as she locked the door. They called the police, but the response was predictable. 2 officers in rumpled uniforms arrived an hour later, their faces etched with boredom. "Probably just pranksters," one said, scribbling a cursory note, his eyes sliding past Marcus like he was invisible. "Not much we can do." They left without a second glance, and the Jacksons were alone again, their dream home, a modest bungalow they'd saved years to buy, transformed into a prison of hostility. The neighborhood itself was a paradox. Elmwood Drive stretched through a working-class pocket of the city, its tree-lined streets and clapboard houses a faded postcard of the American dream. But beneath the surface simmered a resentment that had festered for years, fueled by economic decline and whispered fears of outsiders. The Jacksons weren't the first black family to try settling there, but the others had fled, driven out by slashed tires, broken windows, and notes slipped under doors. Marcus and Angela had vowed to be different, to plant roots and endure. They'd painted the house a soft yellow, hung curtains Angela sewed herself, and dreamed of a garden in the spring. But as winter tightened its grip, that dream felt more like a delusion. It was at a neighborhood Christmas party on December 22, 1984, that the tide began to shift in ways no one could have foreseen. The event was hosted at the Carter's house, a tradition Susan had started years ago to foster some semblance of community. Angela had gone reluctantly, her red sweater and matching skirt a quiet act of defiance against the gray hostility of the season. Marcus stayed home, nursing a beer and the bruised pride left by Margaret's latest barb. "You're slipping, Jackson, don't make me regret keeping you on." He'd waved Angela off with a tired smile, telling her to go play nice, though neither believed it would change anything. The Carter's house glowed with warmth. Strings of lights draped over the porch, a towering pine adorned with tinsel in the living room, the air thick with cinnamon and the buzz of conversation. Neighbors milled about, clutching cups of spiked punch and exchanging forced pleasantries, their eyes darting to Angela with a mix of curiosity and disdain. She lingered near the kitchen, sipping punch and avoiding the clusters of gossiping women, when she heard voices drifting from the study down the hall. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spinning onto the hardwood, and something instinct perhaps drew her closer. She edged forward, peering through the crack, and saw John and Susan huddled on a leather sofa, their heads bent low, their voices hushed but urgent. "I can't stop thinking about him," Susan whispered, her hands twisting in her lap, her voice trembling with a mix of guilt and longing. "Marcus, he's so strong, so magnetic. I watch him in the yard sometimes, splitting wood or fixing that truck, and it's all I can do not to go over there and say something." John nodded, his hand resting on her knee, his fingers tightening slightly. "And Angela, she's gorgeous. That fire in her, the way she holds her head high, despite everything they throw at her. I've never wanted anyone like this. Maybe we should tell them, Sue. Maybe they feel it too." Angela's breath caught in her throat, her heart thudding against her ribs so loudly she feared they'd dare it. She stepped back, the party's noise fading into a dull roar as her mind raced. Swingers. They had to be. She'd heard whispers of such things growing up, tales of couples trading partners in secret, a relic of the free love 70s now fading under Reagan's buttoned-up America. But the Carters, and in love with them. The idea was absurd, yet it fit. The lingering glances, the overly warm smiles, the way John's hand had brushed hers when he'd helped carry groceries one day. She slipped out of the house, her heels clicking on the icy pavement, and burst through her own front door, her face flushed with shock. Marcus looked up from the couch, his brow furrowing as he set his beer on the coffee table. "What's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." She paced the small living room, her words tumbling out in a rush. "John and Susan, they're swingers, Marcus. I heard them talking in the study. They're in love with us. Both of us." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What?" She repeated it, her voice rising with urgency, and something shifted in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe. or the stirrings of something darker, a hunger he hadn't named until now. They sat in silence, the weight of it settling between them like a third presence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across Marcus's face, and Angela's fingers twisted in the hem of her sweater. Then Marcus stood, his voice low and deliberate. "Invite them over, now." Angela hesitated, searching his eyes for a sign of doubt, but found only resolve. She nodded, slipped on her coat, and crossed the yard to the Carters' glowing house. The party was still in full swing, laughter spilling onto the porch, but she ignored it, knocking sharply on the door. Susan answered. Her cheeks flushed from punch and warmth, her eyes widening at the sight of Angela. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Come over," Angela said simply, her tone leaving no room for questions. "Both of you." John appeared behind Susan, his tie loosened, a glass of bourbon in hand. They exchanged a glance, a spark of understanding passing between them, and without a word, they followed her back across the frost-crusted lawn. The Jacksons' house was quiet as the Carters stepped inside, the tension thick enough to choke on. Marcus stood by the fireplace, his shirt unbuttoned to reveal the taut lines of his chest, the firelight dancing across his skin. Angela kicked off her heels, her sweater slipping from her shoulders to pool on the floor, her breath visible in the cool air. John and Susan hesitated in the doorway, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting between the two of them. Then, as if a dam broke, the air ignited. Clothes fell away in a tangle of hands and whispers, the night dissolving into a collision of desire and desperation, a fleeting escape from the world that pressed in from all sides. Susan's hands roamed Marcus's body, her fingers tracing the scars and sinew of his arms, her whispers of his name, a plea and a prayer. John pulled Angela close, his touch reverent, as if she were a goddess he'd worshipped from afar, through countless stolen glances. The act was passionate, raw, a release of months of unspoken longing that had simmered beneath the surface of every polite wave and forced smile. Their bodies moved together in a rhythm born of instinct, the creak of the floorboards and the crackle of the fire, the only sounds beyond their gasps and murmurs. But beneath the heat, a thread of betrayal wove through. Marcus and Angela breaking the vows they'd made under a South Central streetlight years ago. John and Susan crossing a line they couldn't uncross, their marriages fracturing in the pursuit of something forbidden. Dawn broke over Elmwood Drive, gray and unforgiving, and reality crashed in with the force of a sledgehammer. A neighbor, Miss Evelyn Pritchard, a widow with a penchant for gossip and a bedroom window facing the Jacksons' house, had peered through her curtains in the night, her eyes widening at the silhouettes moving behind the thin drapes. By noon, whispers spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, fueled by her breathless retelling at the corner store. "I saw it all," she'd hissed to a cluster of wide-eyed women. The four of them, tangled up like animals. Disgust. The backlash was swift and merciless. That evening, a neighborhood meeting was called at the community hall, a squat brick building 2 blocks away. The room buzzed with outrage as the Carters and Jacksons were confronted, voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. "Degenerates!" shouted Mr. Larson, a grizzled retiree from across the street. "You don't belong here." Mothers clutched their children close, as if the mere presence of the two couples might taint them. The Carters stood pale and silent, Susan's hands trembling, John's jaw tight. Marcus and Angela faced the crowd with defiance, their hands clasped, but the weight of the accusations bore down like a physical force. Word reached Margaret Hensley through the grapevine. She'd been at the diner down the street when Evelyn burst in with a tale, and by mid-afternoon she stormed into the garage, her face twisted with a fury that masked something deeper, something like jealousy. "You're done, Jackson," she spat, slamming a wrench onto the workbench, the clang echoing through the shop. "Pack your shit and get out." "I should have known you'd bring trouble," her voice shook, her eyes blazing with a heat that wasn't just anger, and Marcus realized then that her barbs had always been laced with a twisted kind of want. He grabbed his toolbox and left without a word, the door slamming shut behind him. The fallout was relentless. Landlords, pressured by a coalition of neighbors wielding petitions and threats, evicted both couples within days. The Jacksons' bungalow was foreclosed after the bank, tipped off by a local teller with ties to the neighborhood, called in their mortgage early. The Carter's house was sold under duress, the realtor citing community concerns as buyers backed out one by one. By January, both couples were on the streets, their belongings stuffed into duffel bags, their dreams reduced to ash. Shelters became their refuge. Marcus and Angela in a drafty mission downtown, John and Susan in a church basement across the river. The passion that had briefly bound them was a memory drowned in regret, their lives fractured beyond repair. One bitter night in February, Marcus and Angela sat on a curb outside the mission, their hands clasped against the cold, their eyes hollow as they stared at the flickering streetlight above. A block away, John and Susan huddled on a bench, their breaths fogging in the dark, their love a bitter echo lost to the wind. Elmwood Drive carried on without them, its residents smug in their victory, but the street felt emptier somehow, the silence heavier. The story lingered, a shadow over the neighborhood, whispered in hushed tones at barbecues and card games. Some called it a scandal, others a tragedy, a warning of desire's price, etched into the pavement like a scar. The houses on Elmwood Drive stood as they always had, but the roses Susan once tended withered, and the yellow paint on the Jacksons' bungalow peeled away, layer by layer, until all that remained was the ghost of what might have been.